truck will arrive to the sound of loud sirens, and members of the fire department will let kids experience it close up, dispensing a few little yellow helmets, size small, to be used for photos and not emergencies. Well, the dogs don't like this. The dogs don't like the sirens at all, and some have to be calmed by the owners until the howling stops, and some of the canines, of course, are casting glances around for picnic food, the best kind of food ever. And still others, the dogs, that have suffered the indignity of being dressed up in ridiculous green Lady Liberty crowns and gowns, or in a red, white, and blue Uncle Sam and vest. These dogs have already been forced to walk in the parade, and these dogs carry the look of mortification, an uncertainty as clear as a bell in their faces. Neighbors who otherwise don't see too much of each other for the rest of the year will talk about, at great length, how much they love this neighborhood, and they'll compliment each other on the dishes they brought, and then, with the exception of a few remaining and mangled slices of store-bought pie, the food is quickly gone. The games end. The fire truck drives slowly down Michigan Avenue with its siren, a last bedazzlement to the day, and a signal that it's time to clean it up, pack it away for another year. It's a perfect way, as well as the right holiday, for neighbors within the framework of our little neighborhood to remember that we have ties to one another. And they're important ties. They're social ties, but they go beyond that somehow as well. And we all remember this somehow on the 4th of July. And the 4th of July is also a good time for the church, in fact, I think all religious traditions, to take stock of how we fit into this grand experiment we call America. John Meacham is now executive director and vice president at Random House, and he's a prolific author, and in an article not long ago in the Dallas Morning News, he writes, "The great good news about America, the American gospel, if you will, is that religion shapes the life of this nation without strangling it. Belief in God is central to the country's experience thus far, yet for the broad center, faith is a matter of choice and not coercion. And the legacy of the founding parents is that the sensible center should hold. It does so because the founders believed themselves in work, in the service of both God and humankind, not just for one another. They created a nation in which religion should not be singled out for special help or particular harm either. The balance between the promise of the Declaration of Independence with its evocation of divine origins and destiny, and the practicalities of the Constitution with its checks on extremism remain perhaps the most brilliant American success. And so the issue is ever before us, the relationship between religion and public life, between church and state, and of course, but more than that even, should there be prayers in Congress? Should there be prayers in schools or at public events? Should there be a Christmas nativity at City Hall, and does the addition of a menorah make that all right? Should a politician's religious beliefs influence his or her position on public policy that affects all people, stem cell research, for example, or abortion, or transgender rights, or family planning? Can it even be helped? John Meacham also wrote a book not too many years ago called American Gospel, God, the Founding Fathers, and the Making of a Nation. And in it he argues that the founders intended a nation based on religious conviction, which at the same time avoids sectarian religion and extends religious freedom to all. Meacham points out that the founders' first fight, in fact, was about faith. He writes, as they gathered there for the inaugural session of the Continental Congress in 1774 in Philadelphia, Thomas Cushing, a lawyer from Boston, moved that the delegates begin with a prayer, and both John Jay of New York, a devout Episcopalian, and John Rutledge, a South Carolina planter, objected strenuously. And so that's where the whole argument began, and we've been arguing about it ever since. Things could have gone either way. They could have resolved the issue by ruling no prayer, no religion, no God talk, a totally secular state, but they did not do that. Sam Adams rose and said he was no bigot and he could hear a prayer from a gentleman of piety and proposed that an Episcopal priest, the Reverend Duke, be invited. And so the next day, the Reverend Duke appeared and he read the psalm for the day, Psalm 35. It said, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with those that strive with me." And John Adams that night wrote a letter to Abigail, and he said that he and the entire assembly were stunned and they were deeply moved. They made a choice. They made a choice to bring religion in, but taking care not to abridge the freedom of conscience that was central to their being there in the first place, central to the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson would write for them. It was a freedom of conscience that undergirded the Constitution. And it was something that Jefferson would sit down and write something absolutely wonderful. And both sides of the political spectrum claim to share that intent, and continues on, the intent of the founders on a number of issues, including this one. And so what was it that the founders actually did believe? Jefferson was a rationalist. He was an Enlightenment thinker. He was someone he would call a deist, I think, respectful of religion. He was a believer in God, but he called it nature's God. But he was also a student of Europe's most bloody wars where religion played a part. He wanted none of it. Here, people would be free to believe or not to believe, to belong to whatever church they chose or not. Free not to have to support any religion with their taxes. And no one had ever tried this anywhere before. A state, apart from some established religion, a church free from state support or influence. Jefferson, by the way, died on July 4, 190 years ago tomorrow, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, with John Adams following him by a few hours. And Ken Wyatt reminded me today that 5 years later, James Madison would also die on the 4th of July. 3 presidents in a row, and as Ken sent, you could be sure that James Monroe was happy to wake up on July 5th. Meacham writes, neither conventionally devout nor wholly unbelieving, Jefferson staked out an American middle ground between the ferocity of the evangelizing Christians on the one side and the contempt for religion by the French philosophers on the other. That middle ground Meacham calls the public religion, and he argues that it is the glue that binds us together as a country. What did the founders believe? We hear accounts where clearly words have been put in their mouths very often. Some of them were Orthodox Christians, some were deists like Jefferson and Franklin who believed in God but were wary of sectarianism, and others still were non-believers. What they feared most, Meacham says, was the threat of extremism, which would either impose religion on people against their will or simply oppose religion. What they believe is represented in our 2 texts today, the 33rd Psalm, in which God of creation is praised. The earth is full of the steadfast love of God, where God remains as the creator whose will operates ultimately in history, a God of providence whose hand the founders saw in the great events of their times. Happy is the nation whose God is the Lord, the psalmist wrote, and our founders would have agreed. But they also understood the relationship between faith and freedom, that the basis of all liberty is freedom of heart and conscience, and that it is given by God to every human being, and that no earthly power can or should try to abridge that freedom. In Galatians, Paul wrote about being set free. He says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law," Paul said, "the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, religious freedom itself is fragile. The founders' fear was that it would be exploited and used by extremists who would either impose their religion on others or voluntarily relinquish it in the name of national security, an argument we have heard spoken of since 9/11, or else just eliminate it altogether. James Madison said, every generation will have to preserve and protect that freedom because every generation will be tempted to reduce it, to limit it, or to give it away. In our day, we hear about voices that say our country is a Christian nation that has lost its way and its specific Christian identity under the assault of secular godlessness. Yet we are not a Christian nation, and we never were. We are a country that grants religious freedom so that we can worship freely as we do as Christians, and worship freely as we do as Jews and as Muslims, or not to worship at all. My last Meacham quote on this subject, he wrote, in a treaty with the Muslim nation of Tripoli initiated by Washington, completed by John Adams, and ratified by the Senate in 1797, the founders declared that the government of the United States is not in any way founded on the Christian religion. It says that. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright wrote, we know what a globe plagued by religious strife is like. We do not know what it would be like to live in a world where religious faith is absent. We have, however, clues from people like Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and the Nazis' own version of a soulless Christianity. And so as Christians, along with those who practice their own religion in their own way, today we celebrate, and this weekend, the 4th of July, and the fact that we do live in a nation that is devoted to our freedom of conscience, which means our freedom to practice our faith according to the dictates of our own hearts, and devoted to extending that freedom to all citizens. I love something that William Sloane Coffin once wrote. Coffin absolutely loved his country. He fought for it in the Second World War. He was a CIA agent, and he criticized and demonstrated against it when his conscience required. He wrote, how do you love America? Don't say my country, right or wrong. That's like saying my grandmother, drunk or sober. It doesn't get you anywhere. Don't just salute the flag, he said, and don't burn it either. Wash it. Make it clean. Continue to work to make sure that that symbol is washed and cleaned and purified as much as we can. Reach out. Be kind. Remind each other that our common vision invites us all to coexist, not in spite of, but because of the differences that come into our country in our different people, our immigrants, those people who always bring new wisdom to the table. Albert Camus said, freedom is nothing else but a chance to be better. So be it. Amen. I'm going to ask Sarah to come forward now, and this is an open table. Whoever you are and wherever you are on this journey, you are welcome here.